You guys are going to have to bear with me because I feel emotional today. So just hold with me. When I was a child, I remember summers in the Deep South, hot, sticky, humidity, relieved only by the cool waters of a swimming hole. A rope with a knot tied in it hanging in a big old Spanish moss-covered tree next to the bank. My brothers always seemed to run, grab that rope, and swing themselves madly into the murky bayou waters below, fearlessly. Me, on the other hand, that seemed like such a poor choice. Uncalculated, really. I had a deep resistance to jumping in. You couldn't even see the bottom of that water. And in it, quite often in my experience, unseen things nibbled your toes. In my mind, these were giant catfish, or worse, a water moccasin, a snake the size of my daddy's arm. So I was more of a inch your toes in the water at the edge of the bank kind of girl. Wade into the cool waters with an exit plan in mind in the event something got me. It wasn't until my brother explained in logical middle school fashion that I was more likely to get nibbled with my gentle and calculated approach than by making an entrance that was full of shock and awe, startling whatever was below. It wasn't until I faced my fear and got willing to grab the rope and swing myself from the bank in that bayou did I really get the full-on squealing experience of summers in a swimming hole. Today, I'm leaning into a conversation with you about resistance, not the kind that's a movement, but more so the kind that is a refusal to accept the what-isness of something, the kind of resistance that is born of fear. It is fear in motion, and it seems a necessary part of our human condition. After all, why wouldn't we be afraid? It makes sense, right? Survival. From out there, in the vastness of outer space, new galaxies are being born, and the universe is infinitely expanding. We sit here as the tiniest of beings spinning on a big blue ball in outer space, a ball that has been here for 4.5 billion years. Yet we are here for what feels like a nanosecond of time. Of course we're afraid, as well we should be. When you think about it, the only appropriate response to the position we find ourselves in would seem to be fear. This knowledge, conscious or unconscious, sends us each into a personal reconciliation. And in my work, I see this every day. People grappling with profound questions and starting lots of sentences with, what if? What if I make this choice or that choice? What if I risk? What if I fail? What if they don't love me? You know, the likes. We are all grappling with big questions, some that seem larger than life and unanswerable. What is this thing, life, anyway? How do we bear all the painful and insane things we experience in this world? What are we doing here? What happens when we die? Part of life is grappling with all of these questions because none of us, not even the great philosophers, have the answers. Religion tries to give us guidance and reassurance, but as us seekers and questers in Unitarian Universalism know, it's as calculated a risk as my toes inching on the edge of that bayou bank. After all, resistance is born in the fear of the unknown. It's part of our existential anxiety about life. I say every day in my work as a psychotherapist, anxiety, It's a fancy clinical word for I'm afraid. We are afraid, right? All of us, afraid of everything we see on the news, those people, that movement, that political leaning, those others, scary things happening everywhere all the time. It's exhausting, right? Dan Millman, author of Way of the Peaceful Warrior, says, stressful thoughts reflect a conflict with reality. Stress happens when the mind resists what is. We live in fear continuously of the what isness of our reality. Resistance creates this gap of unnecessary suffering, that space between the way things are and the way we want things to be. We are constantly up against this place where we want to make life better, where we want to know that we matter, and where we often feel so small in the vastness of life. You know that place in Horton, you know that place in that movie or that book where Horton Hears a Who? Where we feel like tiny beings on a speck of dust yelling into the night sky, we are here, we are here, we are here. I want to tell you a story, so please bear with me. I promise it has a point. I wouldn't be a Southern girl if I didn't have a story about my relationship with my mother. So here goes. My mother has been an important teacher in my life. She's been gone now 16 years. Let me contextualize things for you. My mom grew up in Noxapater, Mississippi, 15 miles from Philadelphia, where on June 21st, 1964, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman were tortured and murdered by the KKK with help from the local deputy sheriff. My uncle, my mom's brother, was a sheriff in the next county over most of my life, and I was not quite 6 months old when this happened. This is the tiny spot on our planet where my mother was raised. My mom had a 6th grade education. Her mother made her drop out of school to help around the house while her 2 brothers continued their schooling. She sustained some brain trauma as a teen when she was struck by a car while roller skating as a teenager with her cousin on a country road. My father was my mother's 3rd husband, all abusive alcoholics. I learned after my mother died that she'd actually spent some time in a mental institution before I was born because she had attempted to drown her 3 children in a bathtub. 2 of them were severely physically and mentally disabled because of beatings she sustained while she was pregnant. So trauma, mental illness, and postpartum depression were significant factors in my mom's life. She was pregnant with me when she married my father, abandoning her 3 kids to be with my dad, who was equally abusive to her. My mother, like many women, was doing her best just to get by. Dealing with 3 new children seemed daunting and surely overwhelming to her. She was depressive and unavailable, angry and violent with us. I tell you this story not so you'll feel sorry for my mother or me, but to contextualize the lessons my mother taught me. By the time my mother was my age now, she was vacant. Life had beaten her down. She lived in a small apartment with her cats, and I was her caretaker. Her life was simple, but she, maybe for the first time in her life, was safe and content. One evening, I was sitting at the Shabbat table with my in-laws and our extended family when I received a call. "Come quickly, your mother's had a stroke," the voice on the phone summoned. At the hospital, we learned it wasn't a stroke, which had caused my mother to lose function in her foot. It was metastatic brain cancer. My mother had battled both melanoma and lung cancer for 15 years. Her brain was filled with tumors, and doctors explained she had a few weeks to live. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed and explained what all of this meant to her, and we talked about what she wanted to do with the remainder of her life. The medical team offered her whole brain radiation. I offered to check her out of the hospital and do whatever she wanted to do with the rest of her life. I told her I would support her no matter her choice. The next morning, she asked me to fly with her from Los Angeles to Kentucky so she could see my brothers for one last time and say goodbye to them in person. Then she said she wanted to go from there to Mississippi to be able to do the same thing with her brothers. So I checked my mom out of the hospital against medical advice, and we got on a plane not knowing how long she had. We spent a couple of days with my brothers, one a retired Army Ranger and the other a retired Army drill sergeant. She had raised two men she was immensely proud of, who had spent 20 years of their lives in war-torn parts of the world. These were the boys she loved, and the boys she had also beaten on many occasions as children. So her relationship with them was twisted and complex. The goodbye put a lump in my throat and brought me to tears I didn't want her to see. So I wiped them away alone in the bathroom, out of her sight. Her goodbye, a bittersweet gift to them all, I stood by taking it all in. We departed and headed to Mississippi to the place my mother called home. We spent time with my uncles and even loaded in my Uncle Billy's pickup truck for a trip to the cemetery to visit the family plot. I remember Johnny Cash playing on the radio as we made that drive into Philadelphia. And at moments, we'd break out into song together, singing along. I remember parking and piling out of that truck and walking up the hill to the tombstones that marked my grandparents' graves. I stood once again, taking everything in, as my mom and her brothers decided that my mother was to be cremated and her urn was to be buried next to her parents. That made me chuckle, because they decided to do this without consent from the cemetery. My uncles to order and place a tombstone to mark the place where her ashes were to be buried next to her parents. My mother, in her own words, wanted to come home. The next day, I stood as I watched my mother give a final goodbye to her brothers. The same lump in my throat, the same unbearable grief in my heart. I was awed at my mother's courage and strength. I was awed at her ability to accept the what-isness of her situation. We flew back to Los Angeles, and 3 short days later, my mother died peacefully in my apartment. I sat by her side, holding her hand as she took her last breath. My mother died with the most profound smile on her face. In those short 3 days between landing at LAX and my mom's last breath, I took the opportunity to ask my mom questions and to say things to her I always wanted to say. Those precious days, a gift to us both. We dropped all the history that sat between us, the places where she likely felt she wasn't enough, and I let go of my own hurt and anger, sourced in the resentments and beliefs that she wasn't. I asked her if she was afraid to die. She said, "No, Grenda, I'm not afraid to die. I've had a good life, and I'm ready to go home," she assured me. She told me my grandfather, her beloved dad, had been visiting her, and she knew that she was going to be okay. I've had a good life. I have reflected on those words so many times over the past 16 years. I've often said, my mother did not necessarily teach me how to live, but she sure did teach me how to die. But that statement, I've had a good life, I've learned was filled with so much wisdom and was a remarkable reflection on how my mother lived and actually what she taught me about living. My mom did not inch her toes into the murky waters of life. It seemed she had lived in ways where she jumped from ropes to murky waters below and had experienced encounters with all sorts of scary creatures. She had been pulled under by riptides, spurting water, and near drowning on many occasions. She dragged herself out and laid on the banks of life's bayous, catching her breath many times. Life had not been easy for my mother, but it wasn't what happened to her that awed me. It was her ability to accept life on life's terms, to do her best with what life delivered up, and to end her life filled with gratitude for it. Not as she wished it had been, but for exactly how it had been. It was my mom's attitude that made her remarkable to me. She lived through all of it: trauma, abuse, divorce, institutions, cancer, and in the end, she had gratitude for her life. She had courage to look in the face of the unknowingness of death and go home, whatever that meant to my mom, with open arms and a smile on her face. My mother taught me that the goal of life is not the absence of fear. It's not to not be afraid. The goal of life is to be afraid and do it anyway. To live knowing that being human is fraught with difficulties and things to be afraid of. To live trying to eliminate fear doesn't seem like the goal to me. To know we are afraid and to do it, life, the thing we are afraid of anyway, whether that's jumping into the murky waters below, looking someone in the eye and saying, I love you, I see you, you matter to me. Or embracing your own finite mortality in the face of an ever-expanding universe and leaning into life, looking up at the night sky and saying out loud, we are here, we are here, we are here. I'm filled with gratitude for my mother, for the remarkable lessons that she's taught me, for the woman she's helped me become, and for the journey of life that's brought me here to you, my dear fellow travelers. I am grateful for you, for your journeying with me, and for having the courage to dive off with me into the murky waters of the bayous of life. Let's lean into the fears of this human condition together, knowing that we are not alone and that together we can make a difference while we are mere and amazing specks of dust in this remarkable and ever-expanding universe we call home.